Welcome to your early morning lecture, number 2 for some of you. Thanks for being here. I'm Amanda. I've been attending NORWAC for about 12 years, and this is my first time speaking, which is very exciting and also a little heart fluttery. So bear with me and my Mercury and Pisces a little bit. I do think it's important for me to just tell you a little bit about my background, my lens, and my biases, because you are very much opting into my worldview for the next 75 minutes. So I'll give you some information that's hopefully relevant. It's also a really good opportunity for me to express gratitude to the people who have inspired me and helped me along the way. At the identity level, at least the ones that are relevant right now, I use she, her pronouns. I do identify as queer. That does explicitly reference my sexuality and that I'm attracted to folks all across the gender spectrum. It also just references the fact that I don't tend to fit into categories and boxes like personality tests. I'm just like, dude, can people really choose those options? Like, I've only practiced non-monogamous relationships in my life. I've never been interested in monogamy. I've never been interested in conventional marriage. I've never been interested really in having children, raising children. I deal with multiple chronic illnesses. So those of you feeling the COVID stress, I'm with you. And I'm a mixed race person of color who sometimes passes as white and other times doesn't. And so all of that to say, I'm familiar with the feeling of like not quite fitting in with wherever I am. And so you'll hear that theme a lot coming up. I've been a practicing professional astrologer for about 12 years. I've been teaching for the last 8, teaching and lecturing. And so the goal of my style of astrology is to really help people learn astrology, have like a critical take on astrology, but also refer to their own experience. Like, I want you to figure out how the archetypes live through you rather than like how I tell you they should be living through you or how some mythology says that it should work. I want people to claim power through astrology. I want it to be empowering because I think that a lot of times there's that kind of tendency for a person to approach an astrologer and be like, tell me who I am. And I'm like, I don't want to. Hi. Well, thanks for waiting. So I am on the board of directors for the International Association of Ethics in Astrology. It's a new organization that's trying to educate folks about the many different ethical conundrums we kind of face in the field. And I've been teaching at Portland School of Astrology for the last 2 years. And Portland School of Astrology is amazing. Our website's a mess right now, so there's your disclaimer for that. It is important to note that I believe that we are living through a collective paradigm shift. All of what I teach has that as its underlying thing. So in grad school, I focused on how images of apocalypse, like the mushroom cloud or ecosystem collapse affect us at the psychological level. And so, you know, maybe I have apocalypse consciousness. I like to think that I just kind of see what's going on around us and say like, hey, what are our tools for navigating that? Hi, Sam. Hi. So terms I use to describe my style of astrology include relational. So I'm really interested in the dialogues that I have with my clients and my students. Which is so weird because the setting is not that, right? Like I'm just going to be talking at you. Apologies. I'm very much an evolutionary astrologer, so Pluto and the lunar nodes are my jam. My approach is deeply psychological, which to me gets to the root of the word psychology, which is psyche, which means soul, and logos, which means logic. So I'm really interested in communicating about and understanding the logic of the soul. I think in terms of, you know, if I were to give it an overarching theme, I am a queer astrologer. I am a queerer of astrology. Like, I want to study where it's come from and then make it more relevant to the people that I work with and myself. At the personal level, Gratitude to Patricia Walsh, who's been one of my primary influences and whose work with experiential astrology is, you know, we've woven through everything that I teach. And then to Mark Jones, whose work with how to undo the astrologer as magician guru thing has really impacted me as well. And then finally, in the gratitude section, there are so many astrologers who really have paved the way for what we call queer astrology, right? And so Barry Perlman, Jessica Laniato, Chani Nicholas, Rhea Wolf, Ian Weisler, Demetrius Begley, JP, who I work with at Portland School of Astrology, and probably a few others that I'm forgetting right now. So they kind of all got this thing started around 2012, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So I do just want to note that this is not a lecture about gayness specifically. And I'm saying that because I don't think that it's only queer folks who can queer astrology. I don't feel like, you know, you have to share any of the identities that I have or will be talking about in order to be here. I think this is relevant across the board. This is really just about like leveling the playing field. And, you know, particularly in regards to the ways that people love and relate and express and desire. So finally, this felt important to bring in here that I'm really influenced by the work of Dane Rudyard, who is a modern psychological astrologer or humanistic astrologer. And this is relevant to me because he wrote some really difficult to read books, but was invested in astrology as a way of reorienting human experience. And that's what I feel like it means to queer astrology. Spoiler alert. A little bit of an outline. I want to talk about what it means to queer astrology, why that's relevant and helpful, and then give you some questions to ponder. Specific techniques, and at the end we should have time to do some experiential, at least a little bit of it. So that is part of why I won't be doing my usual stopping and asking if anybody has questions, because I'm on a timeline. It's so weird. Okay. And then also just noting, this could go in so many different directions, right? Like we could talk about queering conferences, we could talk about advocacy work, we could talk about restructuring of the astrological organizations, we could talk about social justice in this. And so I'm just acknowledging that I'm focusing on how to make a practice of challenging our assumptions, and then how to kind of get at what is relevant for people at the individual level when it comes to astrological archetypes. Content warnings. We're going to talk about gender, sex, and sexuality. Sometimes that can be uncomfortable for folks. You know, if you need to like get up to the back of the room and move around a bit, that's fine. If you need to step out, that's fine too. I will be briefly mentioning the AIDS epidemic, as well as violence that happens to bodies of difference. Very generally speaking, I'm not going to bring in specific examples, but I will linger there for a bit. We are going to do experiential work, and so, you know, just remembering that like you have choice, you can opt in or out. And then a word about language. I cuss a lot. I don't know to what extent that's going to come out here. It's a little bit of a surprise, but I've been told that sometimes folks at the bigger conferences don't enjoy that, so there's your warning. Okay. So let's define our terms. We most often think of sexuality as describing a person's relationship to attraction. Okay, but even when we say that, we need to be very broad-minded about that, because that includes things like lesbian, gay, bisexual. It can also include asexual, so a person who doesn't necessarily experience sexual attraction, or demisexual or demi-romantic, right? Like our language just keeps expanding here. And so it's most commonly associated with behaviors and practices, and we can think of sexuality as an identity. Gender Man, defining gender is a rough one, y'all. But for our purposes here, what I want to just, lean into is that gender is a social construct. And that doesn't mean it's not real. And that doesn't mean that I'm trying to be dismissive about it. But it's really important to understand that gender is not anything that's inherent. It is not like located in our bodies in a way that can say, like, we look at this person and we know their gender. All right. So gender is not a static binary truth. People have relationships with gender that fluctuates throughout the course of their lifetime. People can tell you their gender and then you can be like, but you don't look like that, right? And so like a person can tell you that they identify as non-binary and then dress in a way that you consider to be feminine. Okay, so just like expanding the bracket here so that we get back to that core truth of like, hey, what assumptions are you making about a person based on what they tell you or the way that they're expressing? So then gender is not the same as what we might call biological sex, which is also a very problematic term. So gender is not the same as sexuality. Gender is also not the same as sex. It's unfortunate that we have overlapping words in a lot of ways. Transgender is not a sexuality, it's a gender identity. This is gonna be like, a lot of you know this stuff, but just to kind of like go over it so that we are, again, like, how do we think about these things? So sex is most commonly assigned by doctors based on a person's genitalia. But even if we go with like that distinction, it's still not binary, right? Because we have, for example, intersex folks, which I've seen numbers from between like 1% and 5% of the population. But that's when a person's born with reproductive or sexual anatomy that is not male or female or could be both. But if we get into the level of like chromosomes and hormones and all of that stuff that I really shouldn't be talking about because I don't have a scientific enough mind to like do it justice with the explanation, we also have micro expressions there. And so it's not as straightforward as like X, Y, or X, I don't know how chromosomes work, right? So like if you were to look into a person's physiology, sex does not exist as a binary in that sense either. And so all of this to say that like binaries can really help us understand things. Like I'm an astrologer who relies on polarities a lot, but I think of them more as a circle or a spectrum than as something that's linear, that's either one or the other. Okay, I could have put that up before. So, and so again, point being, none of these things are binary. They exist for many people as more of a spectrum. And it can be really helpful to do like ongoing self-inquiry into how you relate to your own identity, right? You identify as male, why? Like what's going on there? Or, maybe now you have more language and you can look back at your life and be like, there were times in my life where if I had had different language or even known what was possible, things might have been different. And so, it's important to acknowledge that diverse expressions of gender and sexuality were really erased by colonial expansion, right? And so expressions outside of our conventional understanding of male and female have existed forever, but they were often labeled as perverse or animalistic or unchristian and therefore sinful and worthy of punishment, right? And so Western gender categories specifically exclude indigenous notions of gender, right? And so many indigenous cultures relate to gender as more of a spectrum or don't even have words for male and female. And so within Western culture, there's been this kind of codification of the idea that there are two genders which are synonymous with sex and that one gender is inherently superior to the others, or to the other, I should say. And so understanding these binary categories matter because they're inherently related to a person's worth in our society. right? And like their inherent value. And that's all just bullshit. Okay. So as I've said, queering astrology isn't just about sex and gender, but it's just important to spend some time there. And some of our examples, we'll have a couple example charts at the end, are going to depict alternative expressions of gender and sexuality, and making room for unconventional or you know, outside the norm or non-traditional, I don't know what the fuck the word is for it there. Making room for what is outside the circle is an inherent part of queering astrology. And you might have even come across like different language for using that. But it's also important to note that queer folks are very, very familiar with wounds around rejection, okay? And just at the base level, being rejected by our families, even in ways that aren't overtly malicious, okay? And in some ways, queer folks have more visibility than ever before now, but around the world, we still see efforts to strip these groups, particularly trans folks, from basic human rights, okay? So still very much an issue. Violence can be overt. Sometimes it shows up in microaggressions, right? Like you tell someone your pronouns and then they make a joke about grammar or whatever. And so it's not as black and white as harm caused because of malicious intent, but at least in my experience with the queer community is well equipped to address these issues, to come up with, you know, alternatives and spaces that help people heal. And so we're worth being listened to, in my humble opinion. Okay. So let's spend a minute with the word queer. A lot of these definitions come from online dictionaries and etymology online. I put things like this up here because I just liked studying the roots of words, but if we look at the bottom here, it comes from a root word that means to twist. I like that, yeah. And you can also see in this kind of timeline here, we are going from an adjective to becoming more of a pejorative term. So then if we get to some modern definitions, which this is just, you know, it comes out of my brain / multiple websites that I looked at to try and get wording. We're looking at queer as an umbrella term for people who are not heterosexual or cisgender. But like I've said, I think that there are many folks who use the word queer just because they don't fit into boxes and categories, right? Like I tend to be pretty adverse to labels, but queer works for me because I'm just like, it's a good descriptor. So hence this lovely meme here that explores that. And so figuring out how to think and talk about and practice astrology ethically is something that I spend potentially too much time on, right? Like it requires a lot of mental gymnastics. It requires a lot of ability to think with nuance. It pushes the uncomfortable things within us, right? Or at least within me. And so again, queering astrology is just one framework that I use for orienting to ethical practice. So a little bit of context. So queer theory is a field of critical theory that emerged in the early 1990s. It was kind of associated with women's studies and then gender studies, and I'm not an expert on it for sure, but one thing that's important to know about queer theory is that it challenges the idea that heterosexuality is the norm, and it challenges the idea that heterosexuality is inherent, okay? So it studies sexuality and gender as cultural phenomena. So queer astrology itself is not necessarily a new thing. There have been gay astrologers forever and ever, right? Just like there's been female astrologers forever, but because of history, we see it coming forward as like a male practice in a lot of ways. Okay, so more recently, one way that we can think about it is that, you know, through the Uranus-Pluto conjunction in the 60s, we have these like seeds of new thought, seeds of transformative thought, seeds of breakthrough that we see in the civil rights movement and the feminist movement, right? That was also impacting astrology. And so as astrology starts to incorporate more humanistic and psychological themes, you know, the Pluto and Leo generation really making their mark, many of whom are still practicing astrology today. We also do have the AIDS epidemic, okay? And so I don't know if we can know the impact that the AIDS epidemic had on the field of astrology. But you know, I wasn't a fully conscious human during that time, but I worked at an LGBT mental health clinic for 10 years, which really put me in touch with just how decimated the gay population and the LGBT population was, not just because of literal death, but because of the mental health toll that it takes to be essentially told that like, there's a plague that is your fault. Okay, and so like if that's something that you haven't studied, maybe worth looking into, because I think like sometimes we hear AIDS epidemic and we know it was bad, but getting into it really helps us understand the ways in which people had to go back into the closet. Okay, including people who are trying to push astrology to be more representative. So I love this quote from the Queer Astrology Anthology that says, "Queering is an academic method that deconstructs the structures of knowledge by identifying the particular bias being pushed by a particular person in a particular position of power. Our job as queerers is to explain what that bias is in astrology and what's going on there." And so what happened during the Uranus-Pluto square is, in short, that a bunch of astrologers who I mentioned earlier were at the United Astrology Conference, and they started having discussions about representation. They weren't seeing themselves and their lifestyles represented at the conference. And it was this question of like, hey, we're here too, right? And like, how does synastry apply to a person who is not in a monogamous relationship or who has a queer relationship, right? Like, I remember right around 2012, I went to like a 5-day synastry training, and the opening of the lecture was the presenter talking about binary star systems and how that was the height of evolution. And so it was with relationships. And I was like, like which of my partners am I going to talk to about this? Right? And so it's just that kind of like, there's still a lot of wisdom in what was being said at the training, but I had to work through a solid 24 hours of just being triggered by it. Right? Because I was like, okay, we're going in with the assumption that like my relationships don't matter. Okay. So from those conversations, we see the Queer Astrology Conference, which Ian just emailed me this morning. There's going to be another one end of this year, beginning of next year, and the website's just up as of today, probably because I was like, give us a website. You get the Queer Astrology Roadshow, which was on the road, kind of like, I remember walking into a classroom and it would have like the directions marked on the walls and like a zodiac on the floor, and you could like move around, and it was really great. And Portland School of Astrology came out of that as well, which is mission-based to have empathy and liberation-based education. And so, you know, in a lot of ways, queer astrology, I think, is so common for some folks now that it doesn't even get named anymore, right? Which is really cool in a lot of ways, but there's still a lot of work to do. So to queer astrology, I've kind of gotten to this already, but to just put it out in slide form, it means to use astrology in a way that's inclusive of identities and experiences that exist outside of heteronormative cis-centric binaries. We could also say that exist outside of white culture, right? So queer astrology is to hold space for potentials and possibilities of what could be, and to look at things different, and to commit to knowing yourself in all your glory, and to be comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty. Now, something that I could have acknowledged earlier and explicitly is that I practice tropical astrology, one of many kinds, right? Like we have so many things underneath the banner of tropical astrology. But this is really relevant here because tropical astrology is based in Greco-Roman mythology. Okay, and so it's not only Greco-Roman mythology, but it's Greco-Roman philosophy about the way that the world works. And so that has all kinds of underlying morality and assumptions and biases. Ding. So knowing that astrology, as it's been transmitted to us, or at least to me, is infused with those Greco-Roman ideas about identity and belonging and worth and value and, you know, humanity, what a desirable body looks like, what luxury should look and feel like. It's important to keep those things in mind, right? Because some of those ideas have become, or even started out as, being incredibly oppressive, okay? And over time, they've gained density and they've been codified not just into our laws, but into our basic assumptions and ideas about how the world works in ways that operate very much under the surface, like very unconsciously. Okay, so how much about what the Greeks had to say about gender and sexuality and marriage and labor and spirituality is still relevant today? Open-ended question. None of the questions I'm going to ask have yes or no answers, by the way. Is that relevance universal? Should it be supposed that it is universal? Why do we keep taking these Greco-Roman ideas and presenting them as if they were, right? And I say this as a person who uses Greco-Roman mythology, like in my own practice, or sometimes to make a point about an archetype. Okay, so I'm not saying like strip it out. I'm just saying like, how can we think about this, right? And where can it be harmful? So before I get into even more questions, let me just talk about whatever the heck it was I meant when I said Saturnian and Uranian approaches to astrology, which I didn't know when I wrote the lecture description. But sometimes I just like using the archetypes as teaching devices. So let's do that. And here we have some basic keywords associated with Saturn and Uranus. And I've heard folks refer to astrology as Saturnian discipline, and I believe that in the traditional approach, Mercury is associated with astrology, and I would consider myself more of a Uranian astrologer, although when I start harping on my students about like using flashcards to memorize their glyphs, I don't know, I can feel Saturn too. But, you know, the first thing about these archetypes that I just want to point out is that they can be used as kind of like, they can be used to create guiding questions for our inquiry. So let's just put up some questions right now. Here's some text-dense slides for you. So as I was doing my third read through of Alice Barkley Catt's fucking amazing book, Post-Colonial Astrology, which I just really, really recommend, although it's dense. One of their core questions is, how can we make astrology more responsible? I like it, right? Because we have the word response in there. We have that Saturnian sense of like, what is responsibility outside of like our weird conditioning, right? How do power dynamics play out in astrological settings? That's kind of getting into this, like, how can we deconstruct those power structures? We have to understand them first. How does astrology perpetuate harmful and social, political, and economic constructs? How might we build new foundations for a more inclusive astrology? How can we heal our relationship with inner and outer authority? How can we use astrology to more accurately and precisely describe a person or community's experience? And then the Uranian questions. How can astrology be used as a tool for liberation into authentic relationship with self, other, and the world? How can astrology support an individual's process of coming out? Like, even if it's just coming out as an astrologer, right? Sometimes that's a whole thing. How can we use astrology to get more comfortable with change and difference? How and where should we disrupt aspects of the status quo? How can we embrace and create safer spaces for the unique, the unexpected, and the diverse? And I think, do this. How can we use astrology to help folks embrace the rainbow at the core of their being? Oh, rainbows, they're so good. And how can we have astrology help me tap into the spark within me so that it can come into contact with the spark within you, and then we can like expand, right, and move forward. It's good stuff. And so astrology to me is as tender as it is powerful. Okay. That was a little bit soapboxy, but it felt really good. So that's all right. So let's switch gears a little bit. Astrology is a way of describing energetics at its core. It describes energy. It's also built on a lot of jargon, on a lot of complexity, and that isn't necessarily meaningful in and of itself. And so, you know, our role as practitioners, whether it's at the personal level or the professional level, is to interpret the jargon. Okay, that's getting a little bit trickier now that so many people come into consults like with this astrological knowledge, right? Because then you're just like, we can just speak the language. But how do we make our interpretations meaningful and supportive of a person's identity, right? While making our language precise and clear and direct.
Can you repeat that?
Maybe.
How do we make a person? How do we make is how it started.
Yeah. Let's see if it's in my notes here.
Like how do we affirm?
How do we affirm a person's identity?
Yes.
While making our language as precise and clear and direct as possible. I'm telling you, Mercury and Pisces, I say it and then it's gone. Okay, so this is also in line with just like making space for a range of possibilities, right? So many astrologers use a lot of gendered language. The tradition is steeped in it. And I'm not here to say that that's fundamentally wrong across the board. I don't think that it is. But I think that we have ways of languaging things that are more relevant, right? Like, so when I say masculine and feminine, then I have to explain what that means, right? It's like, you say it to me and I'm like, what does that mean? Right? Like, what is that? So, you know, what if we use words like inhale and exhale? Which feels really good to do right now, actually. Right? That gives us something to work with. Or inner and outer, right? Like there's an inner expression of a thing or an inner experience of a thing, and then there's like what you do with it out in the world. Or initiating and receiving. Or active and resting, or form and formless. Or, and I have this one in brackets because I hate the word passive. I would prefer to use receptive because I feel like receptive involves like there's choice. Whereas passive is just, it's loaded for me. But that's a pairing that people use too. And so this is not to say that people can't or don't have a profound relationship with the masculine and the feminine. If that is part of your journey, is healing your relationship with the masculine and or the feminine, fantastic. Right? Like I'm going to talk about Venus in a bit and I'm going to use she because I have a profound relationship with Venus and it's a she pronoun relationship. But it's about letting people have their own relationships. And I think oftentimes about just like saying the thing out loud, like I'm going to use these terms and this is why, and this is what they mean to me, right? 15 seconds. Again, just not making the assumption that it's universal.
Now, did you like day and night?
Yes, I don't use them as much, which is probably why they didn't make the slide, but I do like day and night, yeah. Okay. So let's do some little tidbits. Where am I with time? Great. So let's use the planets to kind of explore some of these assumptions just really briefly and break things down a little bit, and then we'll move on to some alternative examples. So let's think of the pairing of the sun and the moon first. My little off-center heart. That's cute. It was that was a memory device for me. So there's many kind of like standard associations with sun and moon. You're going to have your own. But the sun is about light and vitality and aspiration. It's an organizing principle, right? Like the solar system is organized around the sun, astronomically speaking. Solar consciousness loves order and categories, so that might come into it as well. And then the moon is about emotion and the receptive and the nonlinear, the irrational to the sun's supposed rational. And so we can, if we go with this kind of like solar versus lunar consciousness thing, solar consciousness is oriented towards what can be seen, what can be ordered, what makes sense. And in our society, a lot of times people will prioritize what makes sense, right? And then lunar consciousness is oriented towards what lies beneath, what's unseen, what's nonlinear. And so the society I live in tends to privilege the solar above the lunar. It's changing, right? Like I stay in a bubble for the most part where people don't do that. But I think in the bigger picture, it still happens quite a bit. Again, all of this is super nuanced, but if you hear sun as organizing principle and moon as irrational, people place judgments about that, right? Like irrational bad. So another way that I've heard of interpreting sun, moon, and ascendant is that the ascendant is the energy that you use to move away from your moon and towards your sun. Yeah, the ascendant is an energy you use to move away from your moon and towards your sun. The ascendant is kind of like the doorway to the solar principle. Okay, and so when I hear that and I think about how much our society does not let people have their emotions, I'm just like, oh, fuck no, I don't like that, right? Again, maybe it comes into play, sometimes that works. But when I hear those things, I think about how emotions are pathologized, or like if we do anything other than just exist in like a steady, consistent way, we are, again, pathologized or told that we're being just moody, right? There's this kind of like value that's placed on being consistent, and like, I have a Scorpio moon, I'm not consistent, and I like it, right? Like I learn a lot about the world that way. So again, how do our astrological assumptions carry these kinds of assumptions about pathology, okay, and worth and value? If I understand my moon as part of me, not something to be gotten beyond, then I understand what I need to feel safe, to feel happy. I understand what I need to communicate to the people in my life about, right? Moon's good stuff, okay. So then we have the pairing of moon and Saturn. And so sometimes folks will refer to moon as mother and Saturn as father. And again, that can be a really like relevant and precise astrological interpretation. It works sometimes. But is it always relevant or correct to say that moon is mother? Is it representing like mother herself in a person's chart, or a person's experience of mother? Do all children of the same mother have the same moon? I don't know, probably not. And so maybe this is a little bit simplistic, so let's just kind of dig deeper into that. If moon is mother because nurturer, caregiver, and Saturn is father because boundaries, discipline, maybe works outside the home, gender roles, right? Those are gender roles as we've known them for, I don't know, a couple hundred years maybe. And so some folks have fathers who are more of the lunar, nurturing caregiver. And I love to ask questions. Like that's my favorite way of doing astrology. Like I can tell you some things, but I want to like know about your life first so that I can be more precise. And so you know, if I start by asking a client, like, what was your experience with your parents' life, or what was your early childhood experience with, then that gives them the opportunity to say, you know, I was adopted, or I have, you know, I had 2 dads, or as we'll see an example later, like my grandma was my primary caregiver. And then I can tailor my interpretation to fit their actual life. Jupiter, this will not surprise some of you. I'm just gonna go through Jupiter really quickly. But I will say this, Jupiter is a planet that's associated with luck, right? And what is luck? We could say that with walking down the street, you find a $100 bill, lucky, great. But oftentimes in our society, luck isn't as random as that. It has to do with socioeconomic status. It has to do with the way you look. It has to do with race, or the neighborhood that you grew up in, or your access to your partner's medical insurance. What kind of support system that you have. Okay, so it has to do with your relationship to what society has deemed lucky, right? So that's also really highly relevant to interpretation of Jupiter as like the benevolent father of luck, right? So we come to Venus and Mars, which is super associated with masculine and feminine. And, you know, one thing that I like to remember is that they each rule 2 signs. Okay, so an inward sign and an outward sign. There's an inward expression of Venus, Taurus, how I relate to myself, my values, my resources, and an outward expression, how I'm going to connect with you, Libra. So in a lot of ways, the archetypes already contain these things. And so if we think of Mars not being about masculinity as much, right? It's how we fuck, how we fight, how we go after what we want. That's relevant to everyone, okay? What motivates us. So Mars can describe the impact of stress on the body. It can describe our defense mechanisms or our defense strategies. And so I was reading in a book recently, I was kind of surveying my 70s astrology books, and it was saying that Mars is about the type of man a woman would be attracted to and the way a man goes after a woman. And I was like, Venus has to do with how we relate, right? To ourselves, again, Taurus, or to others, Libra. Same book, it's the way a woman attracts a man and the type of woman a man is attracted to. Okay. And maybe that works sometimes, right? But again, it's just like, I think about people who are just reading about astrology and then just like, how do I fit into that, right? So Venus is a tricky one for me, and I should just do a whole lecture on it again. And so again, I'm going to use gendered terms for Venus because of my relationship, but I keep thinking about dignity and stability, which is a super helpful technique in so many ways. I have a complicated relationship with it, but also like, so, okay, I get that Venus is happier in Libra because Venus has access to resources that she's comfortable with, right? It's like being at home. And Venus is in detriment in Scorpio. But like, is Venus unhappier in debility in Scorpio because she doesn't have access to the resources that she needs, or because she's been playing so many freaking roles in Libra in order to keep the peace, right? Like, don't you just get to a point where you're like, I've been nice for 500 years and it's not working, right? So yeah, I am gonna lash out, right? I am gonna say something that's true. And so I think about like, who decides that like niceness is the thing, right? Again, there's more nuance here. But how might traditional society see a woman who is passionate and loud as debilitated, right? I don't know. There's lots of cultural conditioning there. So what if Mars is more about our urge to go after what we want, or how we go after what we want? And what if Venus is looking for shared values? Cool. What if Mars is about independence and Venus is about how we come together? What if Venus is about pleasure, like as we experience pleasure through our five senses instead of like what I'm told should be pleasurable or what I'm told self-care should look like? All right. And I should say that for me, this isn't about like relativism or like everything means everything. Again, like learn your glyphs, right? Like you learn the nuts and bolts, learn the history of astrology. It's so important to understand a thing's history when you're practicing it, also so that you can break it down more effectively. This is not about saying that everything old is bad. I have so much respect for Hellenistic astrology. It's incredible. But it's about paying attention to history, biases, and assumptions. So we have our words again. And some of them look like they might be working in opposition with each other, but as often is the case with me, the question I have is, ¿por qué no los dos? Why not both? Right? We can work with both of them. So where am I at? Okay. I love this quote, so I'm just bringing it here to you. Astrology is not magic. The community that recreates it in the contemporary era is. Yes. And so like that's those slides with all the questions. Those are things I invite you to take with you. Like what role do you have to play in these things? Right? Like I can't do all of it. I don't want to. Right? So if you just like find little areas of your own expertise and interest, then that moves the discipline forward. All right. How much time do I have left?
30 minutes.
30 minutes. Any quicker questions right now before I move on? Are there straightforward questions ever?
When you say you're like not into relativism, but I feel like when you're trying to find the nuances in the binary words, it's sort of like dialectical thinking, like having the option. I just want to know your hot take on that.
Having the option. Yeah, I mean, being in dialogue with the thing is how you build a relationship, right? And so I think about that when like I'm listening to a student give an interpretation of a chart and they say something that I feel like it's just wrong to me, right? But instead of saying like, no, I'll say like, where can you tell me how you came to that? Like, can you explain that to me a little bit more? And then sometimes I'll be like, I think that's actually more of this archetype.
Okay.
Right? But to me, it all just comes down to the dialogue and the questions, right? What was that?
I said thanks for the clarification.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you feel about using gender pronouns for the planets, because I've heard different views about that, and I guess I personally don't have a problem with it, but
For me personally, it depends on the context. So if I'm like writing an article, I will often leave them out, or I will make a point of twisting them, right? If I'm writing something that's very personal to me, I'll use the pronouns that I use, and then like I did in the lecture, just use a disclaimer around it. Again, I don't think that gender has a place in astrology, right? Just getting away from the one or the other type of thing. Okay, let's switch gears. And then hopefully there'll be time at the end for questions too. We'll see. So let's talk about imagination. I threw some collages in here that I made just because I needed images and I didn't want to think about attributions and all that stuff. So it's just easier to use my own stuff. So my favorite way to queer astrology is to use embodiment exercises and experiential exercises. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time thinking about how and why, a little bit of time. So embodiment exercises give a person a way to tap into their tangible experience of a thing, their life history, their memories, their body sensations. And so it's great, they're great tools for developing a personal relationship with the archetypes. And for, helping you understand what astrological configurations mean, in addition to the more heady ways of learning astrology. Excuse me. So embodiment practices for me have a lot to do with imagination. So what do I mean when I use the word imagination? Imagination isn't just something that's like relegated to the realms of the immature child, right? Like imagination is a vital process of meaning making and communication that's central to progress, really. It's central to how we become who we're meant to be. It's central to how society figures its way out of the clusterfuck we're in. It's central to the progress of the human species, right? So in ancient Greek physiology, the heart was an organ for sensation and imagination. So we have sensation and imagination both living together. And this made imagination implicit in understanding and processing our experiences. So it's a vital mechanism for coming into contact with your own divine spark of genius, your purpose, how you relate to the world. And so the idea is that the soul communicates to us through imagination, through images, through the imaginal realms. All right, so the imaginal realms are the realms of the non-linear. And the most simple way to understand that is that images are not just something that we see with our eyes or in our mind's eye when our eyes are closed. Images can come through in all of the different ways we perceive the world, okay? So our inner senses, the clairs, right? We have clairvoyance, which is seeing, clairsentience, which is feeling, right? Feelings are things that live in the body. Claircognizance, which is knowing, and there's several others. And so images can come through, sure, in our mind's eye, but it could also be in, you know, I have like a crick in my neck. Okay, so there's a sensory image. And when I lean into it, I get like even more of an image, right? Like a literal image. But it can also be, you know, a smell that then reminds me of a memory. Okay, so imagery is a multi-dimensional tool that connects the mind, the soul, and the body. So the soul speaks to us, I've already said this, through imagination, through metaphors, right? Man, I just flashed back to a dream I had last night with a bunch of spiders. I forgot about it till just now. That's an image. That's doing something. Okay. And so, you know, this is when I said at the beginning that I love psychology because it's studying the logic of the soul. You know, modern psychology has in many ways tried to reduce it to reduce us to the mind, right? To like cognitive and behavioral drives. And to me, a true psychology is tapping into the wisdom of the psyche, right? The soul, and those non-linear experiences. So when I'm doing these kinds of exercises with folks, oftentimes what I'm doing is asking very open-ended questions. And I do it when I'm doing it with myself as well. So what am I thinking? What am I feeling? What is going on in my body? What am I remembering? What does this part of me want, right? So like, that's really helpful if you're getting at something that's like very, very nonlinear or very somatic. It's like, I'm feeling constriction in my chest. What does that part of me want? It wants me to put my arms out, right? Or it wants me to say no. Okay, so just asking those questions and being open to whatever comes. And then my favorite, just what am I aware of? Because that's the most open of the open questions. So maybe I am tuning into the energy of my Mercury, I have my eyes closed, I'm like connecting with Mercury, and I'm aware of a buzzing in my head. And so I like breathe into the buzzing in my head, and suddenly I see in my mind's eye a dragonfly, and then it like, the picture zooms out, and then I see the dragonfly like dipping into the water. And maybe then I remember a time when I was 5 and my dad was next to me and he's explaining things about dragonflies to me. Now you can take that farther, but just within that, there's so much to work with, right? And that came up in a session once with a person who kept coming across Roman versions of like winged god Mercury and was like, I don't get it. How does that help me? And so I was like, let's see what your Mercury looks like. So we did a little exercise. It was Mercury and Sag. And they were able to then like use dragonfly as a metaphor they could work with, right? They can learn about dragonflies, they can paint dragonflies, they can contemplate dragonfly. But they were also able to think about the ways that their dad taught them, which was very Sagittarian, right? It was very blunt and direct and visionary. And sometimes that was an incredible thing for this person, and other times it was really harsh. Okay. So let me give you a few other examples. Most of these started with me asking a client to close their eyes and imagine standing in their multidimensional chart. Not all of them, most of them. For some of these, I'll have more information. For others, I won't, just depending on the level of consent I got from the person. But this person has 3 planets in Chiron and Taurus in the 2nd house. And they were somebody who practices relationship anarchy, which they described as a way of relating where I get to negotiate relationship agreements and expectations with the people in my life in ways that work for us. I get to prioritize my 3 best friends as much as the partner I have sex with. They also identified as an anarchist in general, which to them meant that they were committed to breaking down societal structures that didn't work and building new ones. And so they had been told by 2 astrologers that relationship anarchy would never work for them because Taurus is possessive and is too traditional. And so they came to me just as Uranus was starting to sweep across, well, just as Uranus had entered Taurus. So I had them imagine standing in their 2nd house, and I asked what they were aware of. And they said that they felt an energy that was purple and undulating, and it was like really tight around them. And they said it felt really good. It felt really sensuous. They were happy to be in the purple energy. And so I asked what undulating purple wanted to do, and it became a path. And so I asked them if they wanted to follow the path, and they started walking along the path. And then they started to see a field with houses, and they saw some of their friends and like planter containers with plants and gray water catchers. And they said, this is anarchy. This is a community that lives in structures they've made themselves. We grow food, we dig wells for water, we barter and exchange. This is the most valuable thing in the world. And now I understand what I want to work towards. So Mars and Gemini in the 12th. And I will say that pretty much every time I've had a client go into a 12th house Mars, there's some kind of drowning situation going on. Treading water, trying to punch through water, but not having it impact. So with this one, they said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but I'm in the ocean, I'm treading water. I have so much fight in me, but every time I open my mouth to call for help, I choke on the water and I don't know which direction to swim in. And I feel so much anxiety. And I said, where do you feel the anxiety? And they said, in my heart. And I said, what does your heart want? And they said, my heart wants to float. What happens if you imagine yourself floating in the water instead of treading? I look up at the sky and my mind is filled with poetry and I feel like I can take on the world. And so they started writing poetry. And then we have Moon in Aquarius conjunct Uranus, squaring Saturn. This was a non-binary person whose father had been a really strong and nurturing presence for them. Their mom was out of the picture, but dad had died when they were pretty young. I want to say around 10. And so grandma played a really strong role in their life, really assuming the position of parent. So when we went into the moon, they felt it in their solar plexus. They said that it felt tight and like it was protecting something. And so I didn't want to push. It's the part that was being protected. I don't ever recommend that you do that because I'm not a therapist. But as we kind of continued on, they said that they were aware of a pain in their shoulder area, like shoulder neck. And I asked what that pain in the shoulder would say if it had words. and they started going, "Arr, arr," and they started like kind of making claws like this. And I was like, what's going on? And they said that there was a mama bear there. And so we did some more work with it, and it was soon revealed that the mama bear was connected with all kinds of memories of grandma, who would always make them feel safe. And they were bullied a lot as a child. And then they would come home and they always just felt included and like it was okay to just be who they needed to be. And so when grandma had died around the age of 21, they had developed this kind of persistent but intermittent shoulder pain. And they hadn't dealt with the grief, right? It was a very Uranus conjunct the moon and Aquarius experience for them. They were like, nope, I'm not going there. So they had all kinds of revelations about this in the session and then after the session, and we were able to kind of like bring in some of that sense of protection, right? And being able to protect themselves, which alleviated all the feelings at the solar plexus as well. So last example, this was a client whose chart I don't have permission to share, but he said it was okay to just tell the story. So we were working with Venus in Libra, and I asked what he was aware of. And he said that he saw a chameleon that was located at the back of his neck. And he said, it's so pretty, but it doesn't feel good. And I said, does it have anything to tell you? And he said, it came from my parents, but also me. It helped me to survive. They never wanted me to be who I am, and they always pushed me to be something else. And so I learned how to be very changeable. It always depended on the circumstances, and I've always been receptive to everyone's needs. So what ended up happening was that this chameleon actually became a huge part of this client's ability to follow through with his dreams of doing drag. This was a really great use of that chameleon energy, and he was able to kind of like come out of his shell and express himself more authentically. So again, holding space for a person's own inner imagery to come through, just like links you into all kinds of shit. That's great. Okay. So, thank you. So there's my little works cited slide. I want to do just like 5 minutes of that exercise here. There's some works cited. I mentioned most of them. Here is some come learn with me fun. Aquarianspirals.com. And I'm just going to move forward to this last slide here, which is where I'm going to take you through the opportunity to just tap into a planet in your chart. Dear my students, I know you've done this a lot. So just give yourself permission to go with the flow, pay attention to what's going on in your body. This can be a great thing to do with a transit. So like if you have, you know, Venus and Taurus with Uranus right there, you can tap into Venus and then like dialogue with Uranus and get a feel for that, right? But right now we're just going to keep it simple because of time. And so, since this is mega switching gears, I invite you to close your eyes and or take a soft gaze if you want to. I'm going to do that. And just take a couple deep breaths. Just let yourself fully breathe into body, whatever that means for you. And you can either call an image of your chart to mind, or just intend to connect with your chart. And so we'll just kind of pretend that your chart is like a multi-dimensional hologram that you can step into. So sometimes it's helpful to just kind of imagine yourself in the center of that hologram. Again, just being aware of that experience of being in the center of the chart, what body feels like, what you're thinking of. Because I know we just moved quickly. Before we move over to the planet, just make sure you have a planet in mind. I would recommend not including the outers in this exercise. And go ahead and just walk over to or intend to connect with the energy of the planet you chose. And just be aware of what you're aware of. Does anything in body change? Do you feel something? What does that planet or that energy want to do? Is there a color or word or other symbol that's associated with that planet? Now, just to explore the contrast a little bit, go ahead and pick another planet. Let this one go. And then either imagine yourself walking across your chart to that other planet or just intend to connect with the energy of that other planet. And notice what's different. Again, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? Is there a specific need that planet has or a gift that wants to come forward now? And go ahead and just let that one go. And take a deep breath. And go ahead and open your eyes when you're ready. And that is all. Any questions?
Okay, so question, more so an observation from the first chart that you did, right? So remember that polyamorous person with the Taurus stellium, right? So something that I've been learning a lot is how planets in detriment tend to act as if they're queer, not necessarily say that they make a person queer, but the way they interact with their energy, it's like queering that planet. I noticed that that person had Venus in Aries, right? So it's queering that Taurus stellium, making it so it's not possessive, but it's still all about universal love and all about being devoted to the people that they're closest with. So it's a very queer way of looking at that stellium, but that's just my commentary.
Love it. Yeah, and that Venus has a lot to say because it's ruling those planets. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Yes.
Just to go like right off that, I have the same placement of the moon, but my Venus is actually in Libra and my Mars is in Scorpio. I have the same perception of relationship.
Yeah. It's like we got to look at everything.
When somebody has an adversity to particularly Hellenistic or older traditional texts because they're so gendered and so Mars is this in a woman's chart and Mars is that in a man's chart. I personally, my eyes just glaze over and I stop reading and I keep trying to interject pronouns that fit for me. I use they, them, keep trying to make it that way, but sometimes it's hard to really dive deeper into older traditions that I would really like to incorporate to my modern practice. Do you have advice for that or other ways to navigate?
Yeah, to me, what it comes down to is like finding practitioners who you know are queer, take a queer lens, right? And so that's like the importance of reading a practitioner's bio, or, you know, in terms of like books, you know, like You Were Born for This by Chani is very surface, but it's a great take on traditional astrology, right? And then also like that just to me, and this is personal, but that to me is like motivation to then like, how can you contribute in that way? Because part of it is just that, you know, Hellenistic techniques, we're just learning about them. And so it's like, you got to learn about them and then start to queer them, right? But I can validate that experience. I also get frustrated with it. Yes.
I was wondering, because to me, like in this conference, I've really fallen in love with just how much stories are associated with all the planets and all of the signs in ways that I've just never experienced. And I feel like because of, you know, the ways that so many of these stories are based in, you know, kind of this time of Europe and domination and la 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 la, like where are the spaces where people are using stories, whether it's from another cultural tradition, like, or thinking about stories that are inclusive of different kinds of bodies and genders? Like, are there ways that people are kind of querying kind of stories by being like, okay, we can tell the story of Venus and Mars in this kind of Greek way, or we could tell it in, you know, this love story of this lesbian older couple that are sexy and from the Harlem Renaissance or something. Like, you know, just like wondering if there's spaces like that, you know?
Yes, there are. Can I name them right now? No, my brain just went completely blank, but I bet people in this room have them, that they're there. I think that we definitely, particularly in terms of like the stories and mythologies, because stories are what connect the mind and the heart, right? So we need relevant stories, but also what I'll tell people sometimes is like, go back to the stories that you loved, right? Go back to the songs you've loved and the movies that you've loved, right? And then like, where do you recognize the astrological archetypes in those? And then can you share it with other people?
Can you go back to the book slide, please?
Books and podcasts.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. No more? Yeah.
I have a way of determining something of importance to the planet, and I was surprised to find the moon showed up in a lot of these paradigm shifting individuals, like, for example, Einstein. And he made the statement that he never used a rational explanation to come up with relativity, but rather he was imagining chasing a moonbeam. And I thought it was really interesting that the moon came up rather than the sun. You know, we think of sun, science, logic, and then also Isaac Newton. I mean, there's a lot of moon that showed up in those instances.
Yeah, that's a good point. A lot of times when I understand science the most, it's by brilliant scientists who are speaking very poetically and with image. And I'm like, okay, I get that. Thank you for sharing. All right. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.